The voicemail lasted less than 14 seconds. At first, it sounded harmless, just background noise, a television somewhere in the distance, dishes clinking softly, a woman breathing too close to the receiver. Then came the voice, calm, almost motherly. "Everything's fine here, dear. He just left." And then silence. No goodbye, no click. Just a strange scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged slowly across a floor before the recording cut off by itself. The family kept replaying it because something about the woman's voice felt wrong. Too controlled, too rehearsed, like someone pretending to smile while standing in complete darkness. The man who was supposed to call back never did. His room sat untouched for days. His cigarettes remained on the table beside an unfinished cup of coffee. And somewhere behind an ordinary little house with flower pots in the yard, the dirt looked freshly turned. The house on F Street looked almost comforting from the outside. Elderly men sat on the porch some afternoons, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly while an older woman moved through the halls carrying bowls of soup or folded blankets. Neighbors described the place as peaceful, maybe a little sad, but harmless. The woman who ran it introduced herself as kind-hearted, someone who took in people nobody else wanted, the poor, the elderly, the sick, men who had nowhere left to go. In a city filled with loneliness, she became known as someone willing to open her door when everyone else closed theirs. And that was exactly what made people trust her. She smiled constantly, laughed softly, and spoke with the gentle patience of her grandmother. When social workers visited, everything looked normal enough. The tenants seemed quiet but cared for. Some appeared frail, others confused, but many of them were older and struggling already, so nobody questioned much when they disappeared after a few weeks. The explanation was always simple. They moved away, reconnected with family, found someplace better, and somehow people believed her every single time. One of the men who arrived there was quiet, withdrawn, and painfully lonely. He carried his belongings in plastic grocery bags and rarely made eye contact with anyone. The woman welcomed him warmly, helped him settle into his room, and told him he didn't need to worry anymore. According to other tenants, she had a way of making people feel safe very quickly. She remembered birthdays, cooked meals, asked about their health. She acted less like a landlord and more like someone's protective aunt. But within days, strange things started happening around the house. Residents noticed doors locked at unusual hours. Some men complained about feeling dizzy after dinner. One tenant swore he heard digging noises outside late at night, though when he looked through the window, he saw nothing except darkness and the faint silhouette of the woman standing near the backyard fence smoking a cigarette alone. The next morning, she smiled at breakfast like nothing had happened, and the man who heard the noises suddenly announced he was moving out. Nobody ever saw him again. Families started calling, slowly at first. A daughter asking why her father missed Christmas dinner. A brother wondering why letters stopped arriving. A caseworker checking on a client whose disability checks were still being cashed despite nobody hearing from him for weeks. Each time, the woman answered calmly. She never sounded nervous, never angry. She always had a story ready before the question even finished. He left with friends. He was talking about going south. He didn't want anyone worrying. The details shifted slightly every time, but her tone never did. Warm, patient, understanding, like she was comforting grieving relatives instead of misleading them. Police received missing person reports, but most of the men were elderly, struggling with addiction, or mentally ill. In the eyes of the system, they were people who disappeared all the time. People's society barely noticed when they vanished. And because of that, nobody looked too closely at the little boarding house on F Street. One social worker couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She visited the house repeatedly and noticed how quickly tenants seemed to cycle through too quickly. Men arrived carrying their entire lives in trash bags and then disappeared without taking any of it with them. Shoes remained under beds. Medication bottles sat untouched in drawers. One room still had family photos hanging beside the mirror even though the tenant had supposedly moved away weeks earlier. When she questioned the woman directly, the response came instantly, defensive but polished. She claimed the men were troubled, unstable, unpredictable. They are, she said quietly, lowering her voice with practiced sympathy. And for a moment, the social worker almost doubted herself, because the woman looked so ordinary standing there in her cardigan with reading glasses hanging around her neck. But then she noticed something strange outside the kitchen window. A patch of dirt in the backyard that looked darker than the rest. Fresh, uneven, like it had been disturbed recently. The police eventually arrived, though not because they believed a murder had happened. At first, they were investigating fraud involving missing disability payments. It seemed minor compared to violent crimes happening elsewhere in the city. The woman welcomed officers inside with tea and polite conversation. She joked with them, smiled, asked if they needed anything. One officer later admitted she seemed more irritated by the interruption than frightened by the investigation. While searching the property, detectives noticed an unbearable smell drifting near the backyard. The woman blamed it on garbage and old plumbing. But then, one investigator saw something protruding slightly from the dirt beneath a peach tree. At first, he thought it was a root. Then he realized roots don't look like human fingers. The entire yard went silent, and the woman standing behind them whispered softly, almost annoyed, "You people are making a big mistake." As investigators began digging, the atmosphere changed completely. Officers who initially expected paperwork and financial crimes suddenly found themselves standing around shallow graves hidden beneath flower beds and carefully maintained landscaping. One body became two, then three. The backyard slowly transformed into a nightmare. Reporters gathered outside the property while neighbors watched in disbelief, struggling to connect the horrifying discoveries with the smiling woman. They waved to every morning, and still, she remained calm. That was the part investigators never forgot. She didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't collapse under pressure. She simply sat in a chair while bodies were carried past her house and occasionally corrected officers when they misunderstood details about the tenants. It unnerved everyone around her. One detective later described the feeling as talking to someone who already accepted death a long time ago. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't sudden violence or desperation. It was organized. Repeated patient, the surviving tenants began sharing stories that sounded insignificant at first but terrifying in hindsight. One man remembered waking up groggy after drinking coffee she made for him. Another recalled hearing coughing and choking through the walls late at night. Several described how she constantly monitored medications, meals, and finances. She knew exactly when disability checks arrived, exactly how much money each resident had, exactly who had family nearby, and who didn't. Single quotes. Then came the discovery that chilled investigators most. Some victims had continued communicating with relatives long after they were already dead. Letters appeared, checks were cashed, signatures were forged carefully enough to delay suspicion. It meant the killings weren't impulsive. They were calculated months in advance. The woman had built an entire illusion around disappearing people, without leaving emotional alarms behind. She understood something horrifying about loneliness. If a person is forgotten enough by the world, their silence can last a very long time before anyone notices. But the biggest shock came when detectives started examining the woman's past. This wasn't the first time death followed her. Decades earlier, there had been elderly victims, druggings, thefts, suspicious circumstances that somehow never fully trapped her. Again and again, she slipped through consequences using charm, manipulation, and the assumption that harmless-looking women couldn't possibly be predators. Every warning sign had been dismissed because she didn't resemble what people imagined evil should look like. Investigators realized the murders on F Street were not the beginning of her story. They were simply the first time someone dug deep enough to uncover it. Beneath the grandmotherly voice and soft smile was a woman who had spent years studying vulnerable people. The way hunters study prey, she chose men society ignored because she understood a brutal truth. Forgotten people disappear quietly, and the more detectives uncovered, the more terrifying the question became. How many deaths had never been connected to her at all? During interrogation, she denied almost everything. Even when confronted with Bodhi's buried steps from her kitchen, she continued speaking calmly, sometimes smiling faintly, as if the entire investigation inconvenienced her more than frightened her. She blamed tenants, claimed accidents, suggested others were responsible. At one point, she even asked investigators whether they had fed her dog while searching the property. The emotional detachment disturbed seasoned detectives more than the graves themselves. Then one investigator placed photographs of the victims across the table. Elderly faces, frail smiles, men who trusted her enough to sleep under her roof. For the first time, she stopped talking. Not out of guilt, but irritation. Like she was tired of pretending. The room fell silent as she stared down at the photographs without emotion. And in that moment, detectives understood something deeply unsettling. They were not dealing with someone who snapped under pressure or killed out of rage. They were facing a person completely empty of remorse. The full truth emerged slowly through evidence, financial records, witness statements, and the bodies hidden beneath the yard. Dorothea Puente had turned a home for vulnerable people into a graveyard. She poisoned residents, stole their money, buried them in shallow graves, and continued cashing their checks while families wondered why calls stopped coming. The sweet, elderly caretaker people trusted had been quietly murdering the very individuals who depended on her kindness to survive. And the most horrifying part wasn't how she killed them. It was how normal she seemed afterward. Neighbors remembered her handing out cookies, laughing in the garden, decorating for holidays while human bodies decomposed beneath her feet. The house remained standing long after the investigation ended, but people who passed it claimed the place felt wrong even in daylight. Too quiet, too still, like the ground itself remembered what happened there, because sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide behind masks. Sometimes they invite you inside, make you dinner, and wait for you to fall asleep.